Joe Kidd.
Joe Kidd didn't play by Western rules, it derailed them, literally. A quiet bounty hunter got handed a script that wasn't finished. The director fought with the star, and the finale they crashed a real train through a real saloon because nobody told them they couldn't. These are 20 weird facts about Joe Kidd. And the bonus? The legendary director who made this film would call it his biggest regret. Load up. This ride gets dusty. Number 1. When John Sturges signed on to direct Joe Kidd, he was a legend. The Magnificent Seven, The Great Escape, Gunfight at the OK Corral. The man knew westerns like the back of his weathered hand. But by 1972, something had shifted. Sturges was tired. Hollywood was changing. The old studio system he'd thrived in was crumbling. And the new guard of directors, Coppola, Scorsese, Spielberg, they were taking over with film school degrees and revolutionary ideas. Sturges belonged to a different era, one built on handshake deals and studio lots. He took the job because he needed it, not because he wanted it. The passion that had driven him through 15-hour days on The Great Escape was gone, replaced by obligation and routine. Years later, in one of his final interviews before his death in 1992, he admitted Joe Kidd was the film he was least proud of. Not because it was bad, but because he'd made it on autopilot. He showed up. He framed the shots. He called action. He moved actors like pieces on a chessboard. But his heart wasn't in the dust anymore. And for a director who'd once poured everything into every frame, who'd fought studios and risked budgets to get things right, that absence haunted him until the day he died. Joe Kidd became his ghost. The film that reminded him he'd stayed in the game too long.
It's Joe Kidd, and Joe Kidd is trouble.
Number 2. Clint Eastwood wasn't the first choice. The studio wanted someone bigger, flashier, more traditionally heroic. They offered it to Steve McQueen first. McQueen read the script over a weekend at his Malibu compound. Liked the bones of it, saw potential in the character, but wanted script changes, a bigger budget, and creative control over the final cut. The studio said no. McQueen walked without looking back. Then they went to Paul Newman. Newman passed without even reading it. He was done with westerns, done with gunslingers, ready to move into grittier character work that challenged him. He'd already made Butch Cassidy and wanted to leave the genre behind entirely. So the role landed with Eastwood. And here's the twist. Eastwood didn't love the script either. He thought it was thin, underdeveloped, and lacked the moral ambiguity that made his Sergio Leone films sing. The protagonist felt too straightforward, too clean, too much like a hero and not enough like a man. But he just started his own production company, Malpaso, and needed projects to keep the machine running. So he took it, brought the script to his Carmel ranch, rewrote some of his own dialogue on yellow legal pads, and turned Joe Kidd into the quiet, brutal anti-hero he knew audiences would follow. What McQueen and Newman rejected became one of Eastwood's most underrated roles. Not his best, not his most iconic, but proof that he could take thin material and make it watchable through sheer presence alone. Number 3. The script came from one of the greatest crime writers who ever lived, Elmore Leonard. By 1972, he'd already written Hombre and 3:10 to Yuma, both classics that changed how westerns talked and moved. But Joe Kidd was different. Leonard wrote it fast, under pressure, trying to pay bills while working on his novels at night. He later admitted in interviews that the screenplay wasn't his best work. It was functional, lean, maybe too lean. There were gaps in the story, motivations that didn't quite land, a third act that felt rushed even on the page. And when the studio got their hands on it, they changed things without asking. They softened the violence Leonard had carefully calibrated. They cut subplots involving Mexican landowners. They rewrote the villain's backstory without consulting Leonard, turning complex motivations into simple greed. By the time cameras rolled, Leonard barely recognized his own script. He never spoke badly about the film publicly, he was too professional for that. But in private letters to friends and fellow writers, he called it a missed opportunity. The bones were there. The dialogue had his rhythm, but the soul got lost somewhere between the typewriter and the screen. Leonard would go on to write, Get Shorty, Out of Sight, and Justified. Joe Kidd became the one he never talked about at book signings.
I told you the deal, $500, and I don't care who pulls the trigger on it.
Number 4. Robert Duvall was supposed to be Mexican. At least that's what the script called for. The villain, Frank Harlan, was originally written as a land-grabbing Mexican rancher, a man exploiting his own people for profit and power. But when Duvall got the role, he refused to do an accent. He'd just come off The Godfather, where he'd played Tom Hagen with quiet intensity, and he wasn't interested in caricature. He told Sturgis directly, "I'm not going to fake being something I'm not. I'll play him as an American businessman, ruthless and cold." Sturgis didn't fight it. He was too tired to fight anything anymore. They rewrote the character on the fly during pre-production, turned Harlan into a corrupt Anglo land baron with East Coast money, and let Duvall play him with icy precision. No shouting, no melodrama, no mustache-twirling villainy, just greed in a tailored suit and a voice that never rose above conversation level. It changed the entire dynamic of the film. Instead of a story about betrayal within a community, it became a story about exploitation from the outside, about white money steamrolling over Mexican land rights. And Duvall made it unforgettable. He didn't chew scenery. He just stood there, calm and certain, and made you believe a man could destroy lives without ever raising his voice. Number 5. The film was shot in 2 completely different locations, and the crew hated both of them. The first half was filmed in Lone Pine, California, a classic Western backdrop with Alabama hills providing those iconic desert rock formations that had appeared in hundreds of films since the silent era. Hot, dry, brutal. Temperatures regularly hit 110 degrees. Water trucks followed the crew everywhere. The second half moved to Old Tucson Studios in Arizona, a purpose-built Western town used in everything from Rio Bravo to Tombstone. Sounds simple, right? Except the 2 locations looked nothing alike. The terrain didn't match. The lighting was different. The color of the dirt changed between scenes. Continuity became a nightmare. The script supervisor, a woman named Margaret Booth who'd worked on Gone with the Wind, spent days trying to make sure characters wore the same costumes, same dirt patterns, same sweat stains across both locations. But if you watch closely, you can see it. Joe Kidd rides through desert scrub in one shot. Then suddenly he's surrounded by pine trees. The shadows fall differently. The sky changes from pale blue to deep azure. It drove the editor insane. They worked around it in post-production, tinting shots, matching exposure, but just barely. For a film trying to feel grounded and real, the shifting geography constantly reminded you it was all just Hollywood magic. Number 6. Clint Eastwood and John Sturgis didn't get along. It wasn't a loud feud, no screaming matches, no walkouts, no thrown scripts. Just a quiet, simmering tension that sat between them for the entire shoot like a low-grade fever. Eastwood had just directed his first film, Play Misty for Me, and he had opinions now. Strong ones, informed ones. He'd question Sturgis's shot choices, suggest alternate takes, rewrite his own lines between setups without approval. Sturgis, a man who'd been directing since the 1940s, who'd worked with Spencer Tracy and Burt Lancaster, didn't appreciate being second-guessed by an actor who'd spent most of his career squinting in Italian westerns. At one point, Eastwood reportedly told a crew member during lunch, "John's phoning it in. He doesn't care anymore." Sturgis heard about it through the grapevine. He didn't confront Eastwood directly. That wasn't his style. But from that point on, their communication became purely professional. Curt, cold, technical. They finished the film, shook hands on the last day like strangers, and never worked together again. What should have been a dream collaboration between a legend and a rising icon became a reminder that respect and ego don't always coexist. 2 strong-willed men, both certain they were right, both too proud to bend. The film survived it. The friendship never existed in the first place. Number 7. The train scene at the end of the film, the one everyone remembers, wasn't in the original script. Not even close. The climax was supposed to be a straightforward shootout in the saloon, gunfire, broken glass, bodies hitting the floor. Standard Western fare that audiences had seen 1,000 times before. But during location scouting in Tucson, someone noticed an old train sitting on a track near the set. It wasn't being used for anything. It was just there, rusting, forgotten, a relic from another production. And someone, probably a stunt coordinator with more imagination than sense, had an idea. What if we crashed it into the saloon? The producers thought it was insane. The insurance alone would bankrupt them. But Eastwood loved it. Sturgis loved it. And once they committed, there was no going back. They reinforced the train with steel plating. They rigged the saloon to collapse on cue with controlled explosives. They brought in engineers to calculate trajectory and speed. And they had exactly one chance to get it right. One take. No do-overs. No second train waiting in the wings. When they rolled cameras and that locomotive barreled through the wooden facade at 40 miles per hour, splintering beams and shattering windows, and sending dust clouds 50 feet into the Arizona sky, the entire crew stood in stunned silence. Then someone started clapping, then everyone. It was the single most expensive shot in the film, unplanned, unrehearsed, and it became the movie's defining image, the moment everyone remembered when they forgot everything else. Number 8. Don Stroud played the psychotic henchman Lamar Sims, and he took the role way too seriously. Method before method was mainstream. Stroud stayed in character between takes, muttering threats under his breath, glaring at crew members who made eye contact, keeping his face locked in a permanent sneer. Other actors found it unsettling. Eastwood found it ridiculous. At one point, during a lunch break, Eastwood walked up to Stroud, who was sitting alone under a tent, still scowling, still radiating menace, and said, "You know we're making a movie, right? You can relax." Stroud didn't respond. He just stared with those dead eyes. Eastwood shook his head, grabbed his sandwich, and walked away muttering something about actors taking themselves too seriously. But here's the thing. When the cameras rolled, Stroud was electric. Unhinged, unpredictable, genuinely dangerous in a way that made audiences shift in their seats. His performance gave the film an edge it desperately needed, a reminder that violence in this world had consequences and came from broken people. So while his off-camera intensity drove people crazy, made makeup artists nervous, and turned meal breaks awkward, no one could argue with the results. Sometimes the best villains are the ones who forget to stop being villains. Sometimes madness, real or performed, is the only thing that makes a character unforgettable.
Mingo.
Number 9. Filming in the desert came with unexpected dangers. Snakes, scorpions, heat exhaustion, dehydration. But the worst incident didn't involve animals. It involved a horse. During a chase scene across rocky terrain, a stunt rider's horse stumbled on loose rock and went down hard, legs buckling, momentum carrying it forward into a tumbling roll. The rider was thrown clear, bruised ribs and a sprained wrist, but okay. The horse wasn't. It had shattered its front left leg, bone visible through torn hide. In those days, there was only one option. A vet was called, but before they could arrive from Tucson, the horse had to be put down on location. The crew stood around in a silent circle, hats off, as a wrangler did what needed to be done with a single gunshot that echoed across the hills. Filming stopped for the rest of the day. Eastwood, who loved horses and did most of his own riding, was visibly shaken. He requested better terrain scouting for all future riding scenes and refused to shoot another chase until safety protocols were upgraded and a veterinarian was kept on standby. Hollywood doesn't talk about moments like this. They don't make it into press kits or behind-the-scenes documentaries, but they happened, and they left scars on everyone who witnessed them. Number 10. Stella Garcia played Helen Sanchez, the female lead, and she almost wasn't in the movie at all. The studio wanted a bigger name, someone with box office draw and magazine covers. They pushed hard for Raquel Welch, who'd just come off 100 Rifles and was hot property. But Sturgis and Eastwood both refused. They wanted someone who felt real, someone who could hold her own against Eastwood's quiet intensity without overshadowing the story with glamour and celebrity. Garcia had done mostly television work, guest spots on Bonanza and Gunsmoke, small roles, nothing major. But her audition was raw, grounded, fierce in a way that had nothing to do with theatrics. She didn't play Helen as a damsel or a love interest or a prize to be won. She played her as a woman fighting for her land, her people, her dignity against forces bigger than any one person. Eastwood saw it immediately. He told the studio in a phone call, "If you don't cast her, I'm not doing the film." They caved, and Garcia delivered a performance that deserved more recognition than it ever got, that should have launched a career. She disappeared from Hollywood shortly after, frustrated by the lack of substantial roles for Latina actresses who refused to play maids and mistresses. Joe Kidd was her moment. And it should have been the beginning, not the end. Number 11. The score was almost classical. Lalo Schifrin, fresh off Dirty Harry and Bullitt, was hired to compose the music. But his first attempt was wrong. Too jazzy, too urban, too modern for a Western. Sturgis rejected it outright after hearing the demo tapes in his office. Schifrin went back, frustrated, and wrote something completely different. Stripped down, lonely. a Spanish guitar over distant trumpets echoing across empty valleys. It wasn't bombastic. It didn't announce itself. It just sat underneath the film like a heartbeat you barely noticed until it stopped. When Sturgis heard the revised version, he didn't say a word. He just nodded and walked out. That was approval. The score became one of the few elements everyone agreed elevated the material, giving emotional weight to scenes that otherwise played too flat. Schifrin later said Joe Kidd taught him that sometimes less is more, that silence and space matter as much as notes. It's a lesson he carried into everything he composed afterward. The film may have been flawed, but the music was perfect. Number 12. There's a scene where Joe Kidd walks into a church during a tense negotiation. It was supposed to be shot in a real chapel in Tucson, but the local diocese refused permission. They'd read the script, saw the violence, the language, the moral ambiguity, and said no, a house of God wouldn't be used for Hollywood's sins. So the production designer built a church from scratch on the back lot, wooden pews, stained glass windows, a crucifix behind the altar, all of it fake but somehow more real than reality. The irony wasn't lost on the crew. They were building a holy space specifically to stage violence inside it. When Eastwood walked onto the set for the first time, he stood in the doorway, looked around at the handcrafted details, the carefully painted saints on the walls, and said quietly, "We're all going to hell for this." He wasn't entirely joking. The scene was filmed in one long afternoon, and afterward the set was struck, dismantled, erased like it had never existed. Sometimes the most sacred things in movies are the most temporary.
Not gonna permit some sheepherder by the name of Louis Chama to get...
Number 13. John Saxon played Luis Chama, the revolutionary leader fighting for his people's land rights. But Saxon wasn't Mexican, he was Italian-American, born Carmine Orrico in Brooklyn, and he knew it was a problem. He spent weeks before filming studying Spanish, working with dialect coaches, meeting with Chicano activists in Los Angeles to understand the politics behind the character. He wanted to get it right, to honor the real struggles his character represented, but on set, some of the Mexican-American extras and crew members resented him anyway. They whispered that Hollywood always cast white actors in brown roles, always took their stories and gave them to someone else. Saxon heard the whispers. It hurt. He tried harder, stayed longer, listened more, and eventually, slowly, some of the crew warmed to him. Not because he was perfect, but because he cared. He didn't just show up and collect a paycheck. He showed up and tried to understand. Years later, Saxon would say Joe Kidd taught him about the responsibility of representation, about what it means to step into someone else's skin and how that's both a privilege and a burden. Number 14. The film's budget was tight, tighter than anyone wanted to admit. Universal was nervous about Westerns. The genre was dying. Audiences wanted modern stories, urban crime, counterculture rebellion, so they gave Joe Kidd just enough money to exist, but not enough to thrive. This meant cutting corners everywhere. Fewer extras in crowd scenes, reused costumes from other productions, stunts that looked expensive but were actually done cheap with clever camera angles and editing tricks. At one point, they ran out of squibs, the small explosive charges used to simulate gunshot wounds. Rather than order more and wait for shipping, the special effects team improvised with firecracker powder and homemade rigs that sometimes worked and sometimes just fizzled pathetically. One stuntman got a minor burn when a homemade squib misfired during a shootout sequence. Production stopped for an hour while they iced his arm and argued about liability. The shot made it into the final film anyway because they couldn't afford to reshoot it. Audiences never knew they were watching a moment that almost sent someone to the hospital. Number 15. Eastwood did more of his own stunts than the insurance company knew about. There was supposed to be a double for the horse riding, the fistfights, the rooftop sequences. But Eastwood kept dismissing him, telling coordinators, "I've got it." He'd grown up riding horses in Oakland, had done his own stunt work on rawhide for 7 years, and didn't see the point in faking something he could actually do. So he rode hard across rocky terrain without telling anyone. He took real punches in bar fight scenes that were only supposed to be choreographed. He climbed onto rooftops without safety lines because he thought the harness looked fake on camera. The stunt coordinator finally went to Sturgis and complained. Sturgis shrugged. "He's a grown man. Let him break his own neck if he wants." It was cavalier, almost cruel, but also pragmatic. Eastwood knew his limits, knew what he could handle, and the insurance company never asked the right questions. The result is a film where the action feels genuinely physical, where you believe this man is actually doing these things because he actually was.
Elma.
Number 16. Lynn Marta played the saloon girl with the memorable presence but almost no lines. She wasn't supposed to be in the movie at all. She was dating a crew member, visited the set one day to bring him lunch, and Sturgis saw her standing there watching. He walked over, looked at her for a long moment and asked, "Can you ride a horse?" She said yes, lying. He said, "You're in the movie," just like that. No audition, no screen test, just instinct. They wrote her into a saloon scene that afternoon, gave her a costume, told her to look tough but vulnerable, and she nailed it in one take. She learned to ride a horse in 2 days for a later scene, taking lessons from the wranglers at dawn before filming started. Years later, she'd joke that Joe Kidd taught her that sometimes you just say yes and figure it out later. Her boyfriend, the crew member who brought her to set, broke up with her 3 weeks after filming wrapped. But she got a career out of it. Sometimes the best relationships are the ones that end just after they give you something you didn't know you needed. Number 17. The jail scene where Kidd sits locked up, waiting, contemplating, that was shot in a real 1880s jail cell that had been relocated to the Tucson set. The cell had actual history, had held actual prisoners a century before, and apparently it still smelled like it. Mildew, rust, something deeper and more unpleasant that no amount of cleaning could remove. Eastwood sat in that cell for hours while they adjusted lighting, fixed sound issues, argued about camera placement. He never complained, but between takes, he'd step out into the sunlight and breathe deeply like a man surfacing from underwater. The cinematographer wanted to spray air freshener, but Eastwood said no. He said the discomfort helped, made him feel trapped, made the character's frustration more real. So they left it. And if you watch closely, you can see it in his eyes. That's not just acting, that's a man genuinely ready to get the hell out of a place that smells like a century of human misery. Number 18. The film premiered in July 1972 to mixed reviews. Critics didn't know what to make of it. Too slow for an action western, too violent for a character study, too morally ambiguous for audiences expecting clear heroes and villains. Roger Ebert gave it 2 stars, calling it handsomely mounted but uninspired. Variety said it felt like a western made by people who've forgotten why we loved westerns in the first place. The box office was mediocre. Not a disaster, but not a hit. It made back its budget and a little more, then disappeared from theaters after 6 weeks. For years, it was a footnote in Eastwood's career. The film people skipped when discussing his work. But then something strange happened. Home video arrived. Cable television needed content, and Joe Kidd found a second life on afternoon broadcasts and rental store shelves. People discovered it by accident, expecting nothing, and found a lean, mean little western that didn't waste time. It became a cult favorite, not through acclaim, but through repetition, through late nights and lazy Sundays, through people stumbling onto it and thinking, that wasn't bad. Number 19. Decades after the film's release, John Sturgis gave one final interview before his death. The interviewer asked about his career, about the films he was proudest of. Sturgis talked about The Magnificent Seven, about The Great Escape, about Bad Day at Black Rock. Then the interviewer asked about Joe Kidd. Sturgis went quiet. Then he said something that made it into every obituary written about him. "That's the one I made for money. The one I made because I had a mortgage. I don't hate it, but I don't love it either. And maybe that's worse. Maybe making something you're indifferent to is the real sin." The interviewer pressed him. Was there anything about the film he liked? Sturgis thought for a long moment. "The train," he finally said. "Crashing that train through the saloon, that was fun, that was pure." It was a small admission, a crack in the regret. But it was something. Even in a film he didn't love, there was one moment that reminded him why he'd fallen in love with movies in the first place. The moment where you blow something up real good and everyone remembers it forever. Number 20. The film left almost no cultural footprint, no memorable quotes that people repeated at parties, no iconic images that became posters in college dorms, no scenes that were referenced and parodied in other movies. It just existed quietly in the middle of Eastwood's filmography, like a rest stop between more important destinations. But here's the thing about films like Joe Kidd. They matter precisely because they're not masterpieces. They show us what workaday filmmaking looked like in an era when movies were still products, still manufactured on schedules with budgets and deadlines and compromises. Not every film can be The Godfather. Some films are just films. They entertain for 90 minutes, they pay the bills, they keep the machine running so the artists can make the art. Joe Kidd is honest in its mediocrity. It doesn't pretend to be more than it is. It's a Western made by professionals who showed up, did their jobs, and went home. And in an industry built on ego and self-importance, there's something almost noble about that. Bonus fact. After filming wrapped and everyone went their separate ways, the train that crashed through the saloon sat in the Tucson backlot for years. Nobody knew what to do with it. It was too damaged to use in another production, too expensive to repair, too much trouble to haul away. So it just sat there, rusting under the Arizona sun, slowly being reclaimed by sand and wind. Tourists visiting old Tucson studios would see it and ask what movie it was from. Tour guides would say, "Joe Kidd with Clint Eastwood," and people would nod politely, not really remembering, not really caring. Eventually, in the late 1980s, the train was scrapped for metal, cut apart and hauled away in pieces. The one truly memorable thing from the entire production gone. Melted down, recycled into something else, maybe car parts, maybe rebar in a shopping mall, and somehow that feels right, because Joe Kidd was never about lasting forever. It was about showing up, doing the work, and moving on. The train did its job. It crashed spectacularly. It gave people something to talk about for a few minutes, then it disappeared, just like the film, just like the Western genre itself. Nothing gold can stay, not even trains that fly through saloons. Joe Kidd was rough, unpolished, and probably forgotten by most. But for 90 minutes in 1972, it put Clint Eastwood on a horse and let him be exactly what he was. A man with a gun and a grudge in a world that was already leaving Westerns behind. If this dusty ride stirred something in you, go ahead and like and subscribe. And tell us in the comments what forgotten Western deserves another look. Thanks for watching, and remember, sometimes the best movies are the ones nobody talks about.